Hello everyone, are you ready for a new comparison video? Enjoy the video and don't forget to subscribe.
I shall not slander the fair state of Massachusetts, nor the state of New York. As President of the United States, the President and Americans. My fellow citizens, current statistics indicate that this country is in its...
I believe that the majority of the plain people of the United States will, day in and day out, make fewer mistakes.
Who are the people? They are not alone the unfortunate and the weak. They are the weak and the strong, the poor and the...
There are some dark pages in the history of the white man's dealings with the Indian, and many parts of the record are...
My countrymen, there isn't anything the matter with the world's civilization except that
I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves. It will support the new administration in every measure which will promote public welfare. It must... Freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed.
We yet realize that America's leadership and prestige depend not merely upon our unmatched material progress.
Into an important strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons.
Every country that I know in that area that is familiar with what's happening thinks it's absolute.
The thousands of volunteer workers in state after state who did far beyond the call of...
With a comprehensive plan to make our country independent of foreign sources of energy.
Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the...
Today, tomorrow, and into the next century, our nation is the enduring dream of every immigrant.
I will never forget the parents of children with autism and other serious conditions who told me on the campus.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack.
My fellow Americans, tonight I want to speak to you about what the United States will do with our friends and allies.
My original instinct was to pull out, and historically, I like...
Here and now, I give you my word. If you entrust me with the presidency, I will draw